The city streets buzzed with life, the scent of sizzling food wafting through the air as people rushed past, lost in their own worlds. Among the many vendors lining the crowded avenue was Miguel, a humble man in his late 40s, who had spent the last 20 years selling hot homemade empanadas from his small cart. His hands, worn from years of labor, moved skillfully as he filled orders, greeting every customer with a warm smile. Miguel had never known wealth, but he believed in hard work, kindness, and the simple joy of sharing a meal. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the pavement, Miguel finally had a moment to breathe. Business had been steady, and he had just enough earnings for the day to buy some groceries for his family. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looking at the last few empanadas left in his cart. Just as he was about to pack up, his eyes fell on a frail figure sitting against the cold brick wall a few feet away. The man looked weary, his clothes tattered and covered in dust, his face hidden beneath an overgrown beard. He sat with his knees drawn up, his fingers wrapped tightly around his stomach, as if trying to suppress his hunger. Miguel had seen beggars before, many in fact, but something about this man made him pause. Maybe it was the way he kept glancing at the food cart, his eyes filled with longing, yet too proud to ask for help. Miguel hesitated for only a moment before picking up one of the warm empanadas and walking over. "Here, amigo," he said, kneeling beside the man. "It's fresh. Eat while it's still warm." The beggar lifted his gaze, his deep-set eyes filled with something unspoken. Gratitude, perhaps, or disbelief. For a moment he hesitated before finally taking the food with trembling hands. He didn't speak, only nodded in appreciation before taking a small bite. The first taste seemed to bring something alive in him, and soon he was eating as if he hadn't had a proper meal in days. Miguel sat beside him, watching in silence. He didn't expect anything in return, nor did he ask for a story. In his heart, he believed no one chose to live on the streets unless life had given them no other choice. After a while, the beggar finally spoke, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" Miguel shrugged, offering a small smile. "Because you were hungry." The man looked down at the empty wrapper in his hands, his expression unreadable. A strange silence settled between them before the beggar exhaled deeply. "I didn't always live like this," he murmured. "I used to have everything, money, a home, a family, but I lost it all." Miguel studied him, noticing now the remnants of what might have once been a different life. His posture, his speech, even the way he carefully wiped his hands with the napkin Miguel had given him. It all hinted at a past far different from his present state. The beggar turned his head slightly, as if debating whether to say more. Finally, he whispered, "If I told you who I was, you wouldn't believe me." Miguel raised an eyebrow, intrigued but not judgmental. "Try me." The man hesitated, his fingers curling around the frayed edges of his coat. Then, with a heavy sigh, he muttered a name so quietly it almost got lost in the noise of the city. Miguel's expression shifted. He knew that name. In fact, most people in the city did. It belonged to someone who had once been powerful, someone who had graced television screens and newspaper headlines, a man whose disappearance years ago had been a mystery no one could solve. Miguel felt his heartbeat quicken. Could it really be him, the same man who had once stood at the top of the world, now sitting in rags on the very streets he once overlooked? His throat felt dry as he tried to process it. If this was true, then this encounter wasn't just an act of kindness. It was something far greater, something that could change both of their lives forever. But before Miguel could respond, A sudden commotion erupted nearby. Sirens blared in the distance, and people turned to look as a group of uniformed officers walked down the street, the beggar's face instantly drained of color. Without another word, he pushed himself up, his movements frantic. Miguel stood too, confused. "What's wrong?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he clutched Miguel's arm tightly, his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to help me," he pleaded, his voice filled with urgency. "They can't find me." Miguel barely had time to react before the officers drew closer. He didn't know what was happening, but instinct told him that this man was in danger, or at least believed he was. And in that split second, without fully understanding why, Miguel made a decision that would change his life forever. He grabbed the man's arm and whispered, "Come with me, now." And with that, they vanished into the crowd, leaving behind the remains of an unfinished meal and a mystery that was only beginning to unfold. Miguel led the man through the maze of busy streets, weaving between crowds and narrow alleys. The city was alive with honking cars, laughter, and the distant echo of sirens. But Miguel's mind was racing too fast to absorb any of it. Who was this man really? Was he in danger, or had Miguel just made a mistake that could cost him everything? They didn't stop until they reached a quiet side street, behind an old bakery. The scent of fresh bread lingered in the air, mixing with the dampness of the night. Miguel finally released his grip, turning to the man who was still catching his breath. "All right," Miguel said, his voice low but firm. "Start talking." The man glanced around nervously before exhaling. "I told you my name. You know who I am." Miguel studied him in the dim light. The more he looked, the more he could see the traces of the man who had once been on every television screen, Daniel Vega, a name once tied to success, wealth, and influence. Years ago, he had been one of the most respected businessmen in the city, running a company that funded social projects, helping communities, and shaping the future of the economy. But then, as quickly as he had risen, he vanished. The headlines spoke of fraud, embezzlement, and a scandal that destroyed everything he had built. Some believed he fled the country. Others thought he was dead, but no one expected to find him here, hidden in the shadows of the same streets he once ruled. Miguel's stomach twisted. "If you're really Daniel Vega, then why are you here? What happened?" Daniel leaned against the brick wall, his fingers rubbing his temples, as if trying to hold back years of regret. "I was set up," he muttered. "Someone in my own company framed me. They made it look like I stole millions, but I didn't. When the police came for me, I knew I wouldn't get a fair trial. I ran. And for years, I've been hiding, living in the shadows, just trying to survive." Miguel frowned. It was hard to believe, yet something in Daniel's voice made it impossible to dismiss. There was pain in his words, the kind that couldn't be faked. But why come back? Why risk being seen? Daniel's jaw tightened. "Because I finally have proof. The person who set me up. I know who it was, and I know how to bring them down." Miguel felt a chill run through him. This wasn't just about feeding a hungry man anymore. This was something bigger, something dangerous. He had spent his life trying to stay away from trouble, keeping his head down, working hard for his family. Getting involved in this could change everything. Daniel must have sensed his hesitation, because he sighed. "I get it. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. If you walk away now, I won't blame you." Miguel looked at the man before him, once powerful, now broken, but still holding on to something. Hope. A chance to clear his name. Miguel had always believed in fairness, in doing the right thing, and deep down, he knew that if he turned his back now, he'd never forgive himself. He took a deep breath. "What do you need from me?" Danielle's eyes lit up with something Miguel hadn't seen in them before. Determination. I need a place to lay low, just for a little while, and then I need to find a way to get my proof into the right hands. Miguel hesitated. He lived in a small apartment with his wife and 2 kids. Bringing a wanted man into his home was out of the question, but there was another option. There's an old storage room behind my food cart, Miguel said slowly. It's not much, but it's dry and safe. Daniel nodded. That's more than enough. And just like that, Miguel's quiet life was no longer quiet. Over the next few days, Miguel helped Daniel in small ways, bringing him food, giving him an old jacket to keep warm, listening to the details of his story. The more he learned, the more he realized how deep the betrayal ran. The man who had framed Daniel was now running the very company he had built, growing richer by the day while Daniel suffered in silence. But the real turning point came when Miguel noticed something strange. One evening, as he was locking up his cart, he spotted a black car parked across the street. It had been there the night before too, and the night before that, someone was watching. Miguel's heart pounded as he hurried back to the storage room. Daniel, he whispered urgently. I think someone's looking for you. Daniel's face darkened. Then we don't have much time. Miguel swallowed hard. He had gotten himself into something much bigger than he had imagined, and now there was no turning back. Miguel's pulse raced as he shut the storage room door behind him. Daniel stood by the small window, peering through the cracked blinds, his expression tense. They found me, he muttered under his breath. Miguel swallowed hard. Are you sure it's them? Daniel turned to him, eyes sharp. It's not a coincidence. They must have gotten wind that I'm back. He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. We need to act now. Miguel had never been the type to get involved in anything dangerous. His life had always been simple. Work hard, provide for his family, and stay out of trouble. But somehow, in just a few days, he had been pulled into a storm he never saw coming, and now there was no turning back. Daniel pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to Miguel. This is everything I have. Names, transactions, proof of what they did to me. I was planning to take it to the authorities, myself, but now, they'll never let me get that far. Miguel hesitated before taking the paper, his hands slightly unsteady. You're asking me to do it, Daniel nodded. You can still walk away, Miguel. You don't owe me anything, but if you take this, you might be the only person who can set things right. Miguel looked down at the paper in his hands. He thought of his wife, his kids, the small life he had built with so much effort. If he got involved, it could put everything at risk. But then he thought of Daniel. Once a man with everything, now reduced to hiding in the shadows because of someone else's greed. He thought of all the times he had watched powerful people crush those beneath them, and how nothing ever changed because good people were too afraid to act. He met Danielle's gaze and nodded. Tell me what to do. That night, Miguel didn't go home. Instead, he took the long route to the local newspaper office, keeping his head low, checking every corner, making sure he wasn't being followed. The city was quiet at this hour, but the weight of what he was carrying made the air feel heavier. When he reached the newspaper's entrance, he hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. A tired-looking journalist sat behind the front desk, barely glancing up until Miguel placed the paper in front of him. I have a story for you, Miguel said. But it's dangerous. The journalist skimmed the contents, his eyes widening with each line he read. By the time he finished, he looked up at Miguel with a mix of shock and disbelief. Where did you get this? Miguel exhaled. From the man they ruined. The journalist didn't need any more convincing. We'll print this, he said firmly. "But if what you're saying is true, this is going to blow up fast. Your friend, he won't be safe." Miguel's stomach tightened. He knew that. He had known it the moment he decided to help. "Just do it," he said. By morning, the city was talking. The front page of every newspaper carried the story of Daniel Vega, the truth about the scandal, the corruption, the betrayal. News channels picked it up. Social media exploded. The name of the man who had framed Daniel was now under investigation, and the authorities had no choice but to act. Miguel returned to the storage room just as the sun was rising. He found Daniel sitting on the floor, staring at the small radio in the corner. "Listening to the morning news. They're talking about it," Daniel murmured, as if he still couldn't believe it. "The truth is finally out." Miguel sat down beside him. "It's over." Daniel turned to him, eyes filled with something that had been missing for a long time. Relief. "I don't know how to thank you." Miguel shook his head. "You don't have to." The sound of sirens filled the streets outside. But this time, they weren't chasing Daniel. They were coming for the real criminals. As the sun rose higher, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a breath he had been holding for years. And Miguel, for the first time in his life, realized that sometimes doing the right thing was worth the risk. Because kindness had started this journey, and in the end, it had changed everything.